at the end of this webinar. So we'll dive in. What we are titling this is the 5 mistakes companies make when expanding throughout Europe. And to introduce myself, my name is Liz Hajjar, and I'm joined here by Juana. So we'll kick off with intros, and then we'll get into the 5 mistakes, if that sounds good. So a little bit about myself. Liz Hajjar, I'm the VP of Global Sales at Oyster. Oyster is a global employment platform that helps companies everywhere hire people anywhere. And a lot of the reason why I joined Oyster was because as a sales leader, I have been looking to hire people everywhere, or hire people anywhere. And so it's a big part of why I wanted to join this company. And to give you a little bit of my background, and then we'll jump into Juana's, is I've been working with HR professionals in sales and HR persona talent acquisition for almost 15 years of my career. I actually worked at Glassdoor before I came to Oyster for 10 years. And during that time, I helped open up the Chicago office. It grew to 140 people. I had a team of 75 between Chicago and San Francisco. It was a wild time, but super successful. And then eventually, a couple of years later, I did move to London. So as somebody who had spent all of her career in North America, I moved to London for 6 years to lead Glassdoor's team in London, Dublin, as well as some of the teams in Germany and France, and really learned a lot about European expansion during my time there. And I kept seeing that there was this strategy that companies, we would have. We really needed to be thoughtful about the strategy as we were going into different countries throughout Europe, and learned a lot of what can go into that, everything from culture, legalities, comp structure, and what that looks like. And that's some of the stuff that we will touch on today. So I'm really happy to be here with Avomind. So Juana, I'll send it over to you to get a little intro and learn a little bit about you before we dive in.
Thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Juana, and I'm a team lead here at Avomind. We are a global recruitment firm created in Berlin. And what we do here is we help startups and scale-ups to hire the right commercial and go-to-market talent as they expand into new markets across Europe, the US, APAC, and beyond. And what I've seen working across LATAM, the EMEA region, and DACH is that when it comes to international expansion, almost always has a hiring problem at the center of it. So the companies know the market that they want to enter, but they underestimate how differently talent thinks. Also, what motivates the talent locally, what a competitive offer actually looks like for each location. And sometimes by the time that they have these details, they already lost months and also the right hire. So that's the problem that we solve. We go deep into the industry, the role, the company, and on the market we're hiring into. Because getting that right is what determines whether the expansion actually works. And I'm really glad to be here with Liz today to walk through the 5 mistakes we see most often, because at the end of the day, every single one of them is avoidable.
Fair. So Juana, wonderful to meet you. Thank you for the intro. And exactly what you said is, how do we make sure that the expansion works? So let's dive into mistake number 1. Oftentimes companies will run into as they expand throughout Europe. So it's treating Europe as one market. Europe is 40 plus countries. And as I mentioned earlier, each of those countries have different compliance laws, different ways that the candidates, the culture is different. The way that the candidates might look at their on-target earnings, of how they expect to get paid, when they expect to get paid. All of that's very different. And so a company might be going into Europe and saying, I'm hiring one person, I'm doing it in the UK, or I'm doing it in London, that one person. So that's one part of it. But what about they want to expand to other countries? They want to hire a few people in London. What should that strategy look like? So Juana, I'd love to talk to you of kind of what local understanding should a company have, and when they're looking to expand throughout Europe, what do you often see, kind of some of the details of some of the mistakes that are made?
Okay, perfect. So the first thing that makes it harder is that the companies usually find out these details a bit too late. So by the time they realize the market doesn't work out the way that they expected, they already made commitments, and there's many aspects that should be taken into consideration. So, for example, starting with candidate motivations. They're not universal, of course, and the difference can be very strong. In Germany and Austria, for example, the work-life balance is something that is a top priority for the candidates. Now, in Southern and Eastern Europe, job title and seniority matters a lot more. So the candidates will weight a role differently based on where it sits in the hierarchy. And also, another example in the Nordics, the autonomy and the flat structures are table stakes. And besides that, also hiring timelines are the same. So for some markets, it's very normal and expected to have a 2-3 round process. Others are okay with a longer recruitment process. And the mistake isn't just having a long process, is applying your normal timeline somewhere it doesn't fit. So, for example, in a fast moving market, you run 7 rounds and the candidate takes another offer. So, you should also consider what is the local demand for the talent that you're hiring. And besides that, there's also notice periods, which companies really forget to think about when hiring. So the average notice period across Europe is on average 2.5 months. But in locations like Germany, for example, we're often looking at 3 months, and it can scale with time. So, for example, if you have a senior employee with 10 years of experience at the company, they could have a 4 month notice period. So, if you're expecting to hire someone to start next month, your hiring process should start months in advance. And finally, something that is really, really fundamental is talking about salary benchmarks. So, the salary benchmarks, they don't travel. What is competitive at home can be very different to what works somewhere else. And not only at a country dimension, but also between cities. So Paris is very different from Nice, Munich is different from Berlin, and even when it comes to the split. So some markets, a 60-40 bonus to base split is standard. In others, the candidates want the opposite. So getting the compensation wrong just doesn't make you lose the hire, but also affects other points such as motivation and also the retention long after.
Fair. Juana, thank you for sharing. And I can even touch on notice periods. During my 6 years in the UK, notice periods were something I had to educate myself on. It's not as common. And I'm speaking from where I'd come from in the North America continent and workforce. So notice periods, as I worked for companies that were headquartered in the US, was something I always had to continue to talk to our US teams for recruiting purposes. You're saying, when do we want that person to start, and work back from what a notice period could be? So I think that's a great shout there. Thanks for sharing.
Yes, sure.
Great. So we just kind of heard different things that happen with different qualifications to think about as you're looking at candidates in different countries throughout Europe. So let's go into mistake number 2. And this is hiring the wrong profile for the market. And I think this is a really interesting one. You might say, okay, we're going to go into this market in Europe, and you might have a high performer in a different location in Europe. So maybe there's somebody in London versus Germany, for instance. You're going to go into Germany and you say, hey, this is this was the skills this person had. This is the comp this person had. This is going to work in Germany. We're going to replicate it and hire somebody just like this. But that's where there's a lot of differences, again, within culture, within how they expect to work. You heard Juana talk about, having time off and what that means for certain countries, etc. So I'd love to jump in, Juana, and get your perspective on making sure that we hire the right person in that market. Because the other thing to think about too is not only who you hire and what skill set you're looking for in that market and culturally what you're looking for in that market, but the other piece is, has that market even been warmed up? Are they aware of your brand? How does that country like to see the brand and kind of be warmed up to this new company coming into the market? So Joanna, would love your perspective on what you see at Avomind with candidates in different markets in Europe.
Perfect. So first of all, the point that you mentioned, the cultural differences, this is fundamental. So before you hire in a different country, you need to understand how is their culture, how they see work, how many hours they work per week. So you really need to understand how they see work, what are the laws locally. So when you discuss with a candidate, when you're trying to find talent, you also have the correct information about this specific location, because this can for sure scare off some candidates if it's very different to what they're used to locally. And also another mistake that I would say that we see the most, and is one that is very difficult to discuss with the client because on paper makes complete sense, is that the instinct is to hire someone who already won. So a very strong track record, someone that understands well the industry. But what also made that person successful was the ecosystem around them. So is what you mentioned, the brand, the inbound, the network, the internal support, and none of that exists yet into a new market. So the first thing we do before we even think about starting to look for this candidate is go beyond the hard skills and the numbers. So has this person built from zero before? Does the kind of challenge actually motivates them, or do they thrive in established structures? Because, for example, a 0 to 1 expansion is a very specific moment, and not everyone is very wired to it. So the candidate needs to not just fit the role, but they also need to identify where the company is right now. And that alignment is what separates a hire that works from one that looks good on paper and struggles 6 months in. And yeah, so the first step is always understanding the local market, all of the cultural nuances, the motivations, the expectations we talked about. And then beyond figuring out and finding out someone who can sell and knows the product, also finding someone who generally matches the company's moment and understands that probably they will be dealing with a very international environment and with different cultures. And another thing that some companies do underestimate is structure. In some markets, this is a non negotiable. So, given Germany as an example, again, some candidates at this level, they do expect a local entity, a proper employment contract, and clarity on how they'll be set up. And if that's not in place, the conversation sometimes doesn't get far. So the candidate is not going to take a risk on a company that hasn't committed to the market properly yet.
Mhm.
So yeah, these are some of the things that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and you really see those cultural nuances. So, Juana, thank you for sharing that. And one thing that sticks out to me there as being a sales leader, how many times we call them emerging markets as we were going into France. We're like, well, here in London, people are hitting their number at this quota. So let's give it to France. I think, it's in Europe, it'll be the same. But again, that's a big miss because it's an emerging market. What have we done from a brand perspective? How are we helping those reps? And I'm thinking from a sales mindset. As people are listening to this, you might come from different departments, but a big lesson that I had to learn as we were expanding across Europe from London specifically with US headquartered companies. So thank you for sharing. Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little bit about the candidates a bit and what we're thinking about with the candidates as we go to hire throughout Europe and culturally what we could see and different nuances there. Let's talk a little bit about mistake number 3, and that's about underestimating compliance and employment complexity. This was a huge lesson to me as, again, somebody who came over to Europe and in North America within the States. There's a lot of, I would say, more similarities than what I saw from legality standpoint than what I saw in Europe and expanding by country by country. So a lot of times there's 2 different ways that companies will go and start to expand throughout Europe. They'll say, hey, we want to have an entity in this country, and they will spend maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, but also so much time to spin up this entity and then hire 3 people, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. So that's one way that people do it. And just for their first few hires, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. The other one is that companies might want to hire contractors and say, we're going to do independent contractors. It's quick. There's different, fewer obligations. We can get right into that. But sometimes based on the legalities and how the European governments will look at this, it could be a misclassification, which could be huge for companies. So let's dive into a little bit, Juana, what you see from a candidate side in the employment, what you see where companies end up getting the employment structure wrong as they're hiring candidates into a new country in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yes. And nowadays I see that we're discussing this more and more. Not only with the companies, but also with the candidates. So what we see from the candidate side starting is that employment structure is a trust signal, and the candidates read it immediately. So for example, take GDPR. In Germany, for example, some candidates do ask how their data is being handled early in the process. So this is a sign of whether the company is serious and prepared. And if there's no clear answer, the candidates may disengage. And what you mentioned, the contractor situation is even more direct. So when a qualified candidate in some locations in Europe, they receive a freelance contract, most of them, they don't see this as like an opportunity of flexibility. They see this as a company that hasn't committed to the market fully. And also in some locations like Austria, for example, the authorities do monitor for what they call self-employment. So where someone is brought on as a contractor but is working as an employee. So there's also the legal risk in some locations. And the knock-on effect is real. So you done the work to find the right person, the right profile, the right market fit, also the right timing, and then the employment structure is what loses them. And of course, this is a very painful place to lose a hire.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. It gets very complex. And actually, from my time in Europe, I started to learn about employer of record. I had different friends and colleagues I'd worked with that were actually on what we say an EOR. And that's what Oyster is. And that's kind of how I got into learning all about it. And as I said, when I opened coming to work for Oyster, I was very interested in it because I had seen it firsthand. And pretty much what an employer of record is able to do is like an Oyster, an employer of record become the legal employer in that country on your behalf. So you don't have to go spend hundreds of thousands to spin up an entity for 1, 2, 3, 8 employees. And also, what if that employee doesn't work out or you decide you want to shut down that entity? There was a lot of talk at companies I've been out of shutting down entities and what would go into all of that. So again, an EOR can help you go into a country, get somebody hired, we'll handle the local payroll, the contracts, all of that. And then you can look to see if that country is where you want to continue to expand or just have a couple of employees there. So it's another option of what we can do to help with some of those legalities as well as time saved for you and your team. So which it's been great because we're helping people employ everywhere. So let's go into mistake number 4. And this is, we've touched on this a bit, Juana, but it's ignoring your culture and go-to-market differences. So very often, again, you might have a playbook that works in one country, but is it going to translate to the other country? And that's really going to go into who you hire. Do they know the market? What have you done as a company to make the market be known that your brand is coming in there? And so I think there's a lot that we can do. So Juana, would love to see what you're seeing from as companies make this transition of ignoring that culture and go-to-market differences.
Okay, perfect. So I would say that the companies that make it well when it comes to expanding to a new location is the ones that start treating the new market as a learning curve. So they come in with a hypothesis, not something fixed, as you mentioned, not a fixed playbook, and they're willing to adapt it. Because what we see a lot is companies arriving with a go-to-market strategy that work at home and assuming this sequence travels. And sometimes, I would say that most of the times doesn't. And for example, again, talking about Germany, the sales cycle are longer, more process-driven, and the decisions move through multiple stakeholders. Trust is built over time, and sometimes rushing this process doesn't speed it up, it just kills it. And when you look into other locations like Spain, the dynamic is very different. So the mistake isn't having a structured approach, but applying the same structure everywhere and wondering why the numbers don't follow is a bit of what we also discussed. And is the same thing for communication styles. So in the Netherlands, it's very often to see a very direct, clear feedback. This is expected between clients, candidates. So to be very transparent with what you think. While in other locations like Italy, the relationship comes first, and how something is said is really important. So sometimes a sales representative that works amazing in the Netherlands is not going to work that well in Italy, and also having the same expectations for both locations is not going to work well. And buyers across Europe, clients, they can tell the difference. What they expect isn't someone who just did a quick research on the market, but someone that actually lives it. So having that cultural fluency really shows up in every conversation. And by showing up in conversations, I mean the references your hire is going to use, the problems they lead with, the ways that they build trust. So that really makes a difference between a team that's present in a market and one that's actually part of it.
Very fair points. And that actually takes us into our final point of mistake number 5. And it's not thinking enough about retention. And I think actually all the points kind of feed into this final one. And then we can open it up for Q&A. But let's think about this. You spent all this time, effort, and money to open up an entity in this country, and you're hiring your first person. You get them in the door, you're excited. You've gone through the right stuff, understand the cultural nuances of that country. You've done all the stuff that maybe we're talking about. This candidate comes in the door and starts working. In 6 months, do they feel supported? Do they feel supported about the market, and the market understands this company's there? Potentially it's just them that's the first hire in this country. But after 6 months, maybe they don't feel that support. They don't see the success. And so they start looking around and they leave 12 months in. Put all this effort into this entity and having this person there, and then they go. And that's what we see a lot of. And Juana, I'd love your take on this, is a lot of effort on that front end stuff, kind of what we've been talking about. And then all of a sudden, candidate comes in and nothing's there. So I would love to hear what you see with the search, especially as you search for candidates at Avomind, what you see about the search coming back around, maybe why that candidate didn't work out, or what are some of the common themes that companies do about that retention piece, what they miss on maybe that first or second hire in that new country they're going into.
Okay, great. So first point is a bit of what you mentioned. There's always this cultural aspect. So sometimes you do hire someone that's great, but they won't adapt to the internal culture and international culture. This can happen. And also, when companies come back to us for a replacement search and we will look at what happened, honestly, it's not because the person wasn't good enough, but most of the time they could do the job, they understood the product, they interviewed well, but maybe they never worked in a business that was still building things from the ground up. Maybe they weren't comfortable with that level of ambiguity. Or even maybe they came in expecting more structure and support than the company could actually give at that stage. So these are the type of things that you don't really see on a CV, but they're usually what decides whether someone stays or not. And we see this a lot with international hires. So if someone doesn't feel properly supported locally or feels disconnected from the business, that also starts to affect things over time. And besides that, compensation plays a very important role too. So what felt like a very strong offer a year ago might not feel competitive anymore, especially in faster moving markets. But honestly, a lot of these situations could probably have been avoided early in the hiring process. So again, once you really understand the market, the company environment, and what kind of person actually works well in that setup, you tend to make much better long-term hires. So talking about our experience, the replacement searches are not only about a lack of talent, but more often is just a misalignment that wasn't spotted early enough. So beyond the cultural aspects, but sometimes also about the moment of the company. And we should also be clear to the candidate about that, understand their expectations and how they feel about that as well.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that insight from like the candidate's perspective, and if you're working with the company, why that attrition might happen. So everybody, that concludes the 5 big mistakes of what we often will see as companies go into the European markets, more than one country. Juana, thanks for sharing your expertise. It's great to hear from you what you see. And it's interesting. We tried to go full cycle almost. So it's kind of the stuff on the front end as you're thinking about the market. Make sure it's somewhat warmed up. Playbook's different from country to country. Culturally, legalities are different country to country. And what I saw a lot was a lot of effort throughout my time in Europe, a lot of effort going into entities to hire 1, 2, 3, 4 people. And was that time, effort, and money really the right resources for the business to make sure that market actually is going to long-term be the correct market? And then, of course, how to support the candidate as the first kind of land hire in that country. How are they feeling included? And how are you supporting as a company the different culturals, the earnings, the on-target earnings for this individual, and that they feel supported. So things to think about, and very much stuff that maybe many of us listening and or Juana yourself I'll say myself learned firsthand as somebody who came from a different continent, North America, expanding, living and expanding companies into Europe. So hopefully some helpful points here and things to think about as any of you look to expand into the European markets. So thank you. Juana, any closing things, or should we go ahead and open it up to Q&A?
Well, yes, just a small thing, but yeah, it's very important to think regarding every step of the process, because sometimes when we think about hiring, sometimes it's just like, let's do this job posting and that's it. But it's what we discussed throughout all of this conversation. You really need to take into consideration all of the nuances, all of the details when it comes to contract, when it comes to notice period. So sometimes even a small thing can affect a lot your hiring process and all of the project of finding the right person when you're expanding. But yeah.
Yep. Thank you for doubling down on that, Juana. I think very important. So great. Okay, let's open it up to Q&A. We actually finished almost just a little bit early, but if we have any questions, we're happy to answer as many as we can.
So, at the moment we don't have any questions, but maybe I can ask, how usually do companies decide whether to expand into Germany versus France or the Nordics? Like, what do you see? It's usually the first go to market in Europe.
Juana, do you want to share anything that you see?
Perfect. So, Ines, what you're asking is what makes the company decide if they want to expand into a market or another? Is that the question?
Yeah, or if you see maybe some company has an idea to enter some market first, but then depending on the regulations or the different laws, they will decide for another.
Yes, perfect. So normally when it comes to expansion, they see an opportunity. So sometimes they see that within a very specific location, a specific market, there's a very high demand for the product that they're offering. And that is a very good possibility when it comes to expanding the company. Or they already tried out in different locations and they see that they have the potential to expand furthermore. So this could also be an option, but it really depends a lot on the product, all of the possibilities, the size of the company. So it really depends on the company in general, what they're selling, and also generally about what each region has to offer when it comes to expansion. What are all the possibilities according each region?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Joanna, I'll just double down on that. I think it's going to take research from the company depending. I'm thinking a little bit sales minded. The product that you're looking at, is that market privy to that product, interested in that product? Is there competition there? And then I think the other thing that I would say too is the talent. Oftentimes, like even when I was opening up an office in Chicago, we're talking US, is we were looking at what type of talent we were going to have. That was going to be a very heavily sales office. When another company I worked at in Europe was actually looking for engineering talent, they decided to go to Poland versus other, oftentimes you do see a DACH or Southern Europe or a Nordic expansion, but they went to Poland based on the type of talent they were looking for. So I think there's a lot of different things that can go into play onto where, and I do think the company will need to do that research to understand which market is best for them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we still have no questions, but
Joanna, I'm actually curious from a recruiting perspective, do you get quite a few candidates that you work with that are excited to be kind of, I say the first hire within that country?
Yes, and this is something that could go both ways. Sometimes the candidates are super excited and they really want to do this because it's a very interesting, challenging when you think about all the things that you could learn, and you also have a very important place when it comes to building an operation locally. So being the first hire, so you also have the opportunity of being a decision maker into that process. So we do have many candidates that are really excited about this possibility because it's huge for any career having this opportunity. But there's also some people that do prefer to work at a very established environment that they can kind of foresee what is going to happen, that they feel also a bit more safe, let's say.
Yeah.
So it is what we discuss. When we are hiring someone, we also need to understand if the candidate they identify with the moment of the company, because some people are going to absolutely love this challenge,
Yeah.
and some people do prefer something a bit more slow paced, something a bit more consistent. And yeah, it really depends on the candidate, but we do have many candidates that love this challenge of setting up a new territory.
Great. I think that's a really fair point. And like obviously Avomind, you guys are wonderful, and that's where people can work with you to kind of find these candidates, right? And I think about, again, when we were doing, I call it like the land team in these different countries as we were expanding. A lot of times the first candidate, not always, but a lot of times they had worked for other startups as the first, second, or third hire, and they were used to and knowing, and sometimes that helps with that last point. Excuse me, the fourth point that we made, or the fifth point on the retention piece. They kind of know what to expect a little bit more. And not saying that candidate's absolutely the right person, but something to think about. I have oftentimes throughout European expansion seen that the land person, one or two, has probably done it before and been the land for, whether it's a company headquartered somewhere else or a company, in a different country or different continent. So, and I love that Avomind, you guys can help support that. If companies come to you and say, hey, we're looking for this type of candidate, you understand those questions to ask. So I think that's important for that retention piece.
Yes, of course. And this is very, very important throughout the recruitment process, is being able to cover every small step that sometimes companies can ignore,
Yes.
because sometimes they don't even have the knowledge about them. So being able to cover that brings a lot of safety for the company when it comes to hiring the right person, and also for the candidate when it comes to finding the right opportunity, the right next step to them.
Love it. Thank you. Good. And is any other questions, or if not, we can wrap it up here.
Yeah, I guess so. And I assume you're also open to any questions after through LinkedIn messages.
LinkedIn, feel free. I'm Elizabeth Hajjar on LinkedIn, but feel free to LinkedIn me if any questions come through. I'm more than happy to answer anything. It's interesting doing and hosting this webinar with you, Juana, and hearing your expertise. Just again, as someone who's watched, European expansion, which is different than, I would say, from where I came from North American expansion in some ways. These things seem small potentially, or very easy to breeze over, but I find it so important to ultimately retention piece and to help the company have success in that country. So this was fun. It was nice to review this and talk through it, and great to hear your perspective.
100%. Also, Liz, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's very nice to hear. And yeah, also, if anyone here has any questions or would like to discuss a bit more about the expansion across different locations, feel free to send me a message. I think, as Liz mentioned, is the same for her.
Please.
And yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Super fun.